In 1980, Atari released the arcade game Missile Command. The game was an instant smash hit both in the arcade and popular culture, and later on home video game systems and computers. The combination of Cold War Armageddon theming, fast gameplay, and a unique controller gave the company its second smash hit in 2 years, following on the massive success of the 1979 hit Asteroids. At the early dawn of the 1980s, Atari seemed to be emerging as an unstoppable force in the new field of electronic leisure. With a successful home video game system, home computers, and hit arcade games, Atari wasn't just a household name, but a corporate powerhouse in the making. Atari would follow the path with their other hit, Asteroids. Atari would create 2 follow-up games, a deluxe version of the arcade game to hit the market quickly, and a true sequel to be released sometime in the future. But Missile Command Deluxe would never make it past field testing, and the sequel would spend 2 years in development. Once it was finally released, it would go on to be one of the lowest produced games in Atari's history. Even today, the sequel is often forgotten about to all but the most loyal vintage arcade game history buffs.
This used to be an Atari Liberator. Now I checked, we had 2 Liberators over the year that remained Liberators. One we donated to a church. And the second one we sold for $1,500 to a collector. It had actually been on my for sale list for 10 years and no one asked about it.
This isn't just a story of a company at its peak power, unable to create a successful follow-up to one of its most popular products. Or is it just a story of a little-known arcade game from a major manufacturer? It's the story of a company failing to innovate due to an obsessive culture of test marketing. It's also a story of a huge parent company unable to create a synergy between 2 of its large divisions.
I'm of the view there isn't really a great legacy attached to Atari Liberator. Having said that, I think probably what it does demonstrate to us is a great example of perhaps how not to create an arcade game towards the end of the golden era.
It's also a story of an early tech empire at its peak power, about to crumble thanks to bad decisions, questionable leadership, and a lack of innovation. This is the story of Atari's Liberator.
3, 2, 1. You are hurled into hyperspace. Your mission, save the human race. The Atari Force, your only friends. Defend your life till the battle ends. You're the Liberator. 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 Space fighter and laser blast, blow the killer saucers down to the last. You find the captives, set them free, bring lasting peace to the galaxy. You're the Liberator. Liberator. Liberator.
In 1976, the hot up-and-coming video game company Atari was bought out by the much older and larger media powerhouse, Warner Brothers. Warner's roots date back to the silent era of film, and they had deep pockets with many resources at their disposal. In the mid-70s, Atari founder and president Nolan Bushnell, along with his team, were in the process of developing what would become the incredibly successful home video game system known as the Video Computer System VCS or 2600. Bushnell was confident that Atari had a huge hit on their hands, but they lacked the cash to properly market the new machine. Seeking outside investors, Bushnell would sell the young Atari to the Warner Brothers Communication Company for around $30 million in 1976. Unfortunately for Bushnell, he would end up getting fired from his own company a few years later.
And the rule was focus on outcomes, not process. And that led to, we don't care when you come to work, we don't care if you come to work, get your job done, we're happy. That translated into, we don't care what you wear to work.
The corporate climate Warner Brothers had brought into Atari was vastly different than the laid-back, almost what some would call a startup company culture today Bushnell had created for Atari originally.
People at Warner, they were all record guys, and they didn't understand that it was more than just the cartridge business. They saw the cartridge business as records. They weren't game players.
No.
They were marketeers and all that. And the company just went way off the rails.
As the Warner suits invaded Atari, profits shot up, but the repressive climate was too much for some key employees who would go on to found competing corporations. Despite a new wave of competition in the marketplace, Atari would continue to be a huge force in the arcade game market. Late 70s Atari arcade games such as Breakout, Sprint 2, and Atari Football would prove to be major moneymakers for the company. Atari's bet on the success of the Atari video computer system would more than pay off. The Atari VCS would continue to be a huge success in both sales and cultural impact for years to come, even outselling newer and more powerful products throughout the early 1980s. Atari would even venture into home computers, with the successful 400 and 800 8-bit computers coming into the marketplace around 1979. Atari's unique brand of products for electronic leisure was hitting a strong note all over the world, and Atari seemed to be in a position to become one of the biggest success stories in Silicon Valley. Atari had the perfect storm of product development: create a successful arcade game, then convert that game for home use to the VCS and to Atari's own home computer systems. On November 19, 1980, Atari officially approved the development of the gaming project that would eventually become Liberator. It had been pitched a month before, on October 22nd, from Chris Downen. Downen has several Atari arcade game classics tied to his name, including the 1985 hit Gauntlet and later Cyberball. Earlier in 1980, another game intended to be the Missile Command follow-up, originally titled Missile Command Deluxe, or eventually Missile Command 2, was not faring well in focus groups or field testing. Missile Command 2 was essentially a two-player head-to-head version of the original game. Test players felt this new version lacked strategy and was less challenging than the original. By the end of 1980, almost after a year in development, Missile Command 2 was shelved by Atari. Missile Command had been a huge hit for Atari, so the focus would be on Liberator to carry the torch, as the sequel to the game now known as Missile Command 2 had been given the axe by about December of 1980. Liberator would go by several different names during its development, but initially it was called simply Space Station War Game. The concept of the game was to create a first-person perspective missile command over top a rotating planet from a space station. The concept of a planetary defense system seems extremely similar to the proposed concept of the Star Wars defense system in the United States during the Ronald Reagan presidency. The game project description is noted that the planet will not resemble Earth, probably a wise PR move. As the game evolved during the initial development phase, several key changes would be made. The single defending space station concept would eventually evolve into 4 space stations and then 4 spaceships, one in each corner of the screen. An original proposal of a zoom function, which would allow the player to get closer to the planet, would be dropped, possibly due to restraints in the power of the computing hardware which the game was based on. One of the biggest challenges would be the missile bases on the planet itself. Originally, the game was to feature both enemy and allied bases, having the player defend the allied bases and destroying the enemy bases. The final version of the game would feature only enemy bases and attacks from the planet's surface. The hardware design was initially to be based on the Missile Command 2 PCB set, with a special hardware added in order to create the animation of the rotating planet in the center of the screen. A standard Atari Audio Regulator 2 board would also be used for power distribution and sound control. November 23rd would be the official start of hardware design, and the key programmers would change early in 1981. It appears that Donna Bailey, the legendary programmer from Atari Centipede, was originally attached to the Liberator project, but she would instead focus her energy on an unreleased game called Cloud 9, which is also known as Weather War. Initial development of the game was extremely long, according to Atari memos, as the first engineering review of the game wouldn't take place until June 25th of 1981, almost 9 months after the project had been approved. This is much longer than the typical development time at Atari during this era. There was a good bit of blame on the reasons for this to go around, including blaming rookie engineers, program changes, and a green project leader. It was here during the first engineering review that it was decided to turn the space stations into a fleet of ships. Other changes proposed was to make each planet slightly different in each level, improve the pseudo 3D graphics in the game, and use larger 64K ROMs for the planet in order for a larger color palette. Other notes in the engineering review state the need for a vivid, attractive screen, better on-screen interactions for the player, and a need for sounds and scoring, which were not completed as of this date.
So Liberator was released at a time when Atari was going through a transition, if you like. They were about to drop standard resolution monitors and move to medium resolution monitors. And it strikes me that if you look at what's going on screen with Liberator, the standard resolution monitor doesn't quite deliver that vision. It's graphically quite complex if you compare it to its sort of peers released, perhaps the year before, something like Centipede or Missile Command.
Atari's engineers and designers didn't just have to contend with appeasing their bosses when creating a new game or product. All proposed arcade game projects at Atari had to face a rigorous run of both focus group testing and on-location testing during the prototype phase of the game's development. If a game was seen as performing below expectations, it would not be approved for production. This obsessive testing was frustrating to Atari's designers as they felt it limited creativity and innovation. However, it would be the feedback from this field testing and focus group testing that would bring upon changes in gameplay in order to hopefully make the game more successful in the market. Product testing on Liberator started on October 8, 1981 at a shopping mall in Sunnyvale, California, with 2 different groups. The overall reaction to the game was favorable. Players interviewed suggested changes in certain play mechanics and visuals and wanted more variety in the game. Some of those specific changes would be better explosion animation, the addition of deep space waves away from the planet's every 4th wave, and a better development of the shield function. The first field testing of the game would start on March 26th in 1982 at Merlin's Castle in San Jose, California. Field testing of the game would continue at numerous arcades and convenience stores throughout 1982, right up to the production of the finished product in late fall of '82. The game would often share testing locations with several other Atari products in development at the time, including the game Lunar Battle, which would be renamed Gravatar, and the game Kangaroo, developed by Sun Electronics. Early 1982 testing would find the game earning well for the first week and then dropping off in later weeks. As later testing would commence in the summer of '82 and in the fall, the earnings became much more sporadic and disappointing. At the famous Malibu Grand Prix Arcade, testing of a pre-production Liberator happened in August of 1982. The game's earnings were towards the bottom of all the arcade games in the establishment, with rival titles from other companies like Nintendo's Donkey Kong, Sega's Turbo, and Midway's Tron earning 2 to 3 times as much one quarter at a time. After almost 2 years in development, the future earning potential of Liberator was looking rather bleak. 2 years before, it seemed an Atari in-house developed Missile Command sequel was an easy win for the company. Now the game was in serious trouble. During the course of 1982, Atari was relying more on licensed arcade games developed by other manufacturers, mostly from Japan. Atari's inability to create innovative new games in-house was noted not only by the coin-op industry, but was starting to create discontent within the company itself. Some in Atari felt several of the licensed games were of low quality and not worthy of the Atari name. Others felt slighted that after years of hard work on their own projects, these licensed games seemed to be getting a quick and easy release into production. Many of the projects in Atari were space shooters, a genre that was fading in popularity somewhat with the arrival of games like Nintendo's platformer Donkey Kong. Rich Adam was Atari's lead programmer for the arcade game Lunar Battle, which would be released under the title Gravatar. In a scathing company memo dated April 5, 1982, he makes his frustrations about Atari's reliance on these licensed games and his hate for the game Kangaroo in particular very clear. Adam refers to the licensing strategy as license fever and an epidemic. Adam's opinion of the engineering management team at Atari is that they can no longer distinguish between a product that is junk and one that has the quality the public identifies with Atari. Adam also cites the impact of releasing these games over ones developed by Atari's own in-house teams as a very real morale problem. Despite this frustration within the Atari development offices, in-house developed games, for whatever reason, seem to be taking a beating in 1982 when compared to the licensed games from Atari that they would release from such manufacturers as Sun Electronics and Namco. After 1982, Atari would only ever produce one other in-house game that would see a production over 10,000 units, despite lofty predictions otherwise. This shift in gamer taste, along with Atari's inability to provide a more innovative product produced in-house, was known throughout the company. In a September 1982 confidential Atari report on Liberator's test phase for its prototype, it was noted that the development of Liberator had started well before the development and release of games such as Midway's hit Tron or Sega's Zaxxon, and that the demand for a Missile Command sequel by 1982 was minimal at best by the gaming public. Also, that Liberator had missed its release window for a successful launch. This official Atari document goes on to call Liberator a mediocre product that cannot compete in a saturated market with better games such as Tato's Jungle King. In addition, operators are well aware of Atari's 1982 track record, the report states. There have been no internally developed hits, and especially no hit-spaced themed Atari games. 1982 was a bleak year for Atari's in-house development.
I thought love was only true in fairy tales, meant for someone else but not for me. Love was out to get me, that's the way it seemed. Disappointment haunted all my dreams. Then I saw her face, now I'm a believer, not a trace. I got my mind, I'm in love, and I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. I thought love was more or less a given thing. Seems the more I gave, the less I got. What's the use in trying? All you get is pain. When I needed sunshine, I got rain. Then I saw her face, now I'm a believer, not a trace. doubt my mind. I'm in love, and I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried.
Atari needed help to hopefully turn the future of Liberator around, and Atari's parent company Warner Brothers possibly had the solution. DC Comics, the legendary comic book company and home to classic characters such as Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, was also owned by Warner Brothers. In the early 1980s, DC Comics was going through a bit of a renaissance after struggling against rival Marvel Comics for many years. This revival was led by the introduction of the 1980 comic book, The New Teen Titans. Warner saw an opportunity to fill a need with Atari and create a hit for DC Comics. This would not be the first team-up of Atari with DC Comics, however. Atari had produced a Superman-themed pinball machine in 1979, as well as an innovative Superman-themed Atari 2600 game cartridge. Atari had a bit of a challenge as the video game industry was maturing in the early 1980s. With the smash hits of games like Pac-Man from Namco Midway and Donkey Kong from Nintendo, companies were able to take characters with minimal personalities but humanistic qualities and create a merchandising bonanza. Clothes, notebooks, toys, and cartoons started pouring out for these popular video game characters, creating a huge revenue stream for their owners. Atari, on the other hand, while having some huge arcade hit games, didn't really have these kind of characters in their pixelated toolbox. While Pac-Man had himself a wife, a baby, along with named ghost characters to create storylines for cartoons and plaster all over puffy stickers, Atari had games like Asteroids and Centipede with bugs and space rocks. Despite Atari's best efforts, more kids were likely to want to be Pac-Man for Halloween than, say, the asteroid from Asteroids. The solution was to create characters specifically for marketing and narrative storytelling. This would give Atari more control over the narrative of these characters and allow for future profits with licensing of said characters. Enter Atari Force, a comic book series originally given away free inside certain Atari cartridge boxes created with fellow Warner Brothers division DC Comics. Atari DC would go on to produce several other specific game-themed comic books for inclusion in cartridge boxes beyond the Atari Force theme. These included ones for Centipede, for Yara's Revenge, and for the Sword Quest series of games. The first 5 Atari Force comics would come packaged inside home versions of the games Defender, Berserk, Star Raiders, Phoenix, and Galaxian. These comics are considered to be mini comics due to their size, so they could easily fit inside the game boxes. The comics were written by DC Comics veterans Gary Conway and Roy Thomas. The artists included several DC Comics regulars such as Gil Kane and Dick Giordano. The plot of these comic books is a basic science fiction-based story and often incorporates Atari properties or licensed ones into the stories. The Atari Force is a special space force of Earthlings in the future, all from different nations, using the multi-dimensional starship named Scanner 1. Atari Force's mission is to look for a new planet for the population of Earth to inhabit, since in the future, Earth is facing a huge ecological crisis. Atari in the comic book is called ATARI, standing for Advanced Technology and Research Institute, and the Force is led by Martin Champion as a mission commander. The rest of the team was a multicultural and gender diverse one, which is perhaps an attempt to appeal to a wider variety of gamers, but a welcome and surprising attempt at inclusion of representation for the early 1980s. Atari and Warner Brothers were planning to transition the free comic books into both a series of video games and into a series of newsstand comic books in order to profit over these characters. Atari Force would eventually expand into a monthly newsstand comic book, with the first issue dated January 1984. The monthly version was illustrated by one of the all-time great comic book artists, Jose Garcia Lopez. Garcia Lopez was also the artist responsible for the approved official DC Comics illustrations that were used in licensed products throughout the 1980s, so it's no surprise he was part of this attempt at creating a licensed property. The DC Comics newsstand issues of Atari Force numbered 4 and 5 consisted of material originally intended to be used for free cartridge pack-in comic books numbers 6 and 7 in the release of Atari 2600 games Gravitar and Tempest. Gravitar would go on to originally be an exclusive mail-in order game through Atari Age magazine, and the Atari 2600 version of Tempest would never make it beyond the prototype phase. In a 1984 interview for Comics Interview magazine, DC Comics editor Andy Helfner praised the fan reaction to DC Comics' monthly Atari Force offerings. He went on to say, "Response has been phenomenal. I can't believe how many letters we got on the first issue, at least 400, which I think is tremendous." On June 22, 1982, a meeting took place between several key members of the Liberator development team, Atari management, Warner Brothers management, and several staff members of DC Comics. It was during this meeting it was decided to blend the Liberator game with the Atari Force characters for better storytelling, a stronger consumer tie-in, and possible merchandising for the future. Part of the marketing would include an Atari Force Liberator themed comic book, which would be included in certain newsstand DC Comics as a special insert on comics dated January 1983. The story and much of the art was reused from the comic book given away inside home releases of the Atari game Phoenix. The title of the story was changed from Phoenix to Liberator, as well as some of the art.
So if you look at the overall package of Liberator, they try to make it more than just a video game. So they have this tie-in with DC Comics, and their attempts to deliver this backstory was clearly going to always be very difficult through the medium of an arcade video game. Take an operator. What they don't want is kids standing around in an arcade, arms folded, reading a story on a screen. They want them to put a quarter in, right?
This Atari Force tie-in would cause Liberator to include Atari Force Commander Martin Champion to be included on cabinet artwork, as well as on certain on-screen graphics. The narrative of the game would mirror the narrative of the comic book created for the game, including the story elements and scenario of the invading Malagon armies. Commander Champion pops up in the game to give the player hints, as well as warnings on upcoming new enemies in the progressive levels of gameplay. Plans were made to print over 100,000 free comic books to give away as promotional tools. Also discussed was the future possibility of branding another upcoming arcade game, Toland's Web, which would be released as Black Widow eventually as an Atari Force themed game. This would all compound with a plan to put into place earlier in May when Warner Brothers' newly reopened animation division for television, along with Atari, had started planning an animated cartoon series based on Atari Force. The proposed cartoon series would have had ties to both Liberator and the Black Widow arcade game. The animated TV show seems to have never gotten beyond pre-production. Electronic music legend Suzanne Ciani would be hired to produce several Atari promotional songs and music bumpers, including one for Liberator. According to Ciani, the Liberator song was intended to be used for promotional commercials, which also seem to have never been shown or possibly released. Liberator would finally go into production on October 15, 1982. The first 25 arcade games manufactured would suffer from a number of build quality issues. Some of these issues included sagging bezels, poorly fitting cabinets, and a control panel that could cause injury if unlatched. The upright cabinet design was a modified version of the cabinet Atari had used for the release of the upright Asteroids Deluxe game, but with a unique top bracket for the marquee and a unique control panel. Liberator was finally ready to launch. Unfortunately, it wouldn't quite take off like Atari was hoping. On November 18, 1982, the Amusement and Music Operators Association show, or AMOA, kicked off their annual trade show for the coin-op amusement industry in Chicago. Every major and minor manufacturer would be there to show off the latest and hopefully the most profitable games for the coming year. Atari had a large presence at the show to showcase 4 new arcade games: Pole Position, the classic racer developed by Namco; Quantum, a color vector game co-developed by Atari and General Computer Corporation; Millipede, which was a sequel to the popular game Centipede; and Liberator. Out of the 4 games, Pole Position seemed to be the only Atari game with any sort of major industry buzz, although over time, Millipede would become a minor success for Atari as well. The dominant industry buzz of the show would come from competing products such as the future smash hit Q*bert, Nintendo's Popeye, and Midway's Baby Pac-Man.
I remember when the game came out, brand new, never made any money. I sold one at our distributor that did the Atari products.
Trade magazines and industry reporters didn't so much criticize Liberator as mostly ignore it, written off as a late-to-market Missile Command follow-up and paling in comparison to other offerings at the trade show. The promotional blitz of an Atari Force tie-in to the Liberator game seems to have never really taken place after the AMO trade show debut. Even Atari's own in-house produced magazines and trade newsletters seemed to ignore Liberator almost immediately after the trade show debut. Atari seems to have pretty much shown off Liberator to its buyers, the buyers shrugged their shoulders, and Atari did the same in return. Atari seemed to understand ahead of time that the industry response to the introduction of Liberator would be lethargic. A month before the AMOA debut of Liberator, a decision had been made to cap production of the game at around 750 units, an astonishingly low number for a major manufacturer of arcade games during the peak of the Golden Age. In an inter-office memo dated October 11th, 1982, there was an attempt to diminish the anger from the production team on Liberator's stillborn release from Liberator project leader Chris Dowand. Dowand felt the low production was justified due to the poor field testing and that engineering has messed up the gameplay, or player interest has shifted away from high-tech shooting games. Dowand attempts to put a positive spin on the matter, stating that Liberator has a strong future if it can be marketed with the comic book Atari Force. He goes on to compare the Atari Force tie-in with the success of Midway's Tron game, which Dowand calls a game with mediocre gameplay at best.
But I remember it was not a moneymaker. I physically vended one briefly, and then it broke. I think it went in the warehouse until this fellow ordered it, right? Yeah.
With poor pre-orders for the game and little to any industry buzz, Atari quickly swept Liberator under the rug despite 2 years of development and scrapped any future Atari Force arcade game tie-ins. Atari home computer versions of Liberator were in development by the start of the summer of 1982, when Atari still felt the game had a decent future. Prototype code for this home version still exists, but it has not been made public. Although there is no evidence of Liberator ever being converted to the Atari 2600 or the 5200 system, it's a safe bet that Atari would have eventually made versions for its home systems if the game had been even a moderate success. Out of all the US Atari arcade games released in 1982, only Liberator, Space Duel, and Quantum would never see official home releases from Atari. Planned versions of Liberator, Cocktail, and Cabaret cabinet versions of the game would never be made beyond the prototype phase. European release versions were slated to be manufactured in what Atari referred to as the Euro cost reduction style cabinet, in which many of Atari's European related and released games came in. Only the dedicated US upright version would ever be released, and none of the 762 units produced would be officially exported anywhere outside the USA or Canada. The planned Atari Force animated show would also never see the light of day, but that didn't stop Atari Force, the comic book, from moving on. DC Comics would continue to produce Atari Force newsstand comic books up until 1986. The last free Atari Force comic book packed inside of an Atari 2600 game would be released with the game Galaxian during the month of April of 1983. DC Comics would also produce 2 deluxe large format comic books called, at the time, graphic novels, based on the Atari video games Star Raiders and Warlords. Atari-related comic books enjoyed a brief reboot in 2017 from publisher Dynamite.
Recently, I've had a very good friend of mine ask me if I'd be willing to share my thoughts on the classic arcade game Liberator. I'd be happy to, but unfortunately I've never seen or played the game. Twin Galaxies in Ottumwa, Iowa was my home arcade as a kid growing up, and it wasn't nearly as big as people imagined it to be, so I've never actually seen or experienced the game firsthand. I looked it up on YouTube a little bit ago and watched some video of it. It looks like an interesting game. I'll have to try to find it somewhere out in the wild someday.
Liberator is a decent playing game, with some nice graphics and some decent ideas. The rotating plan animation is surprisingly smooth for a game released in 1982. The dedicated upright cabinet was one of Atari's better looking ones from the era, which is really saying something considering Atari made some very handsome cabinets. And the gameplay is fast-paced with some decent thrills. Liberator can also be a bit tedious. It has a lack of variety, it has subpar sound effects, and the integration of Atari Force into the game seems very tacked on and adds nothing to the game itself. Atari was fairly foolish to think Liberator would have stood a chance to be a major hit in the arcades during 1982 through 83, with more innovative titles such as Cooper, Donkey Kong Jr., or Pole Position populating the local arcade. Atari's reliance on developing space-themed shooters, while the video game market was moving towards character-driven platform-style games, was another huge mistake. Internal Atari documents as late as spring of 1982 had predicted that 20 to 30,000 Liberators would be sold, which would have made it one of Atari's biggest hits ever. Liberator's failure, however, was the least of Atari's problems as 1983 dawned over Silicon Valley.
Atari Incorporated is making cuts, but it will be employee cuts. The video game maker says it plans to lay off about 300 workers. At the same time, an Atari spokesman says there are plans to expand the sales and engineering staffs by about 100. Last year, the company lost over $500 million, laid off more than 2,000 of its Bay Area workers, and moved part of its operation to Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Atari's post-1983 demise has been well documented by many historians and gaming enthusiasts. Atari's financial failings would cause the company to be split into 2 different corporations, Atari Games and Atari Corporation. Although both divisions would have minor successes during the late 80s through early 2000s, they would never come close to the high water mark of Atari in the early 1980s. Liberator was a product weighed down by corporate tie-ins, excessive test marketing, and a lack of support. A space game not so much launched as seemingly released purely from momentum. Atari ignored much of its own data from the obsessive test marketing and group testing of Liberator. Atari and Warner also completely overestimated the draw of the Atari Force branding. Although the comic books might have been a success, both as the free giveaways inside games and on newsstands, the Atari Force theming was poorly implemented into the Liberator game and offered no added gameplay at all. Games derived from the original Missile Command concept for home computers and home video game systems were commonplace in the early 1980s. The evolution of Missile Command style gameplay can be seen not just with Liberator, but with a series of games, such as the somewhat obscure Atari 2600 game Mad by US Games, which incorporates a 2-player co-op gameplay much like the unreleased Missile Command 2 arcade game. Also in Magic's excellent Atlantis game. There were also more than a fair share of copycat games and straight-out Missile Command bootleg versions during the 1980s, a common practice in the early years of video game history. After Liberator's release in 1982, a number of games would pop up throughout the years, expanding on the planetary defense theme, such as Sega's Global Defense, which is also known simply as SDI, and Sega's Japanese exclusive Galactic Protector for the Mark III home video game system. Computer games such as CinemaWare's SDI and Cosme's Defcom 4 expanded on the Liberator themes, but tend to downplay the more comic book narrative elements. As the 90s and early 2000s rolled in, newer reworkings of Missile Command would show up for gaming systems such as the Atari Lynx, the Sega Genesis, Game Boy Color, PlayStation, and the Atari Jaguar. In 2018, IDW Games even released a board game version of Missile Command.
It's a rarity though now, isn't it?
Today, Liberator is mostly a little-known footnote to the legacy of Atari. Liberator was included in a recent version of an Arcade 1-Up home arcade game system. It's also made available on collections from time to time on modern gaming systems, retro systems, and other gaming platforms. Other lower production Atari arcade games from this era, such as Quantum and Major Havoc, seem to have garnered much more interest within the gaming collector community than Liberator can ever seem to quite muster. Out of the 762 Liberator upright machines ever made, it's hard to say how many of them still exist in their original condition, but I'm willing to bet many of these machines ended up being converted into more profitable games for the operators who bought them. Although Liberator would fail to become a successful arcade hit for Atari, the development and eventual rollout of the game is an important peek into the history of Atari. Its failure due to corporate turmoil, developmental red tape, would follow other failed products for Atari throughout 1983 and 1984. Today, it's commonplace to see heavily licensed games from film properties, comic books, television shows, and other media sources. The concept of creating a licensable character for a video game is also fairly common today, and these characters tend to be the cornerstones of large video game companies. Unfortunately for Atari, Atari Force would not have the lasting appeal of, say, a Mario or a Sonic the Hedgehog. The legacy of Liberator may be one of a failure to launch, but it also should be a legacy of a prediction of things to come within the industry.
Space fighter and laser